The boardroom fell silent when I slid the resignation letter across the mahogany table. 12 years of partnership, dissolved in 12 seconds. The director of operations, Richard Pembroke, barely glanced at it before letting out a laugh that still echoes in my memory. "Anyone can manage accounts, Nathan. You're not irreplaceable." I stood up, straightened my tie, and said 5 words that would reshape the entire logistics industry on the East Coast. "I invite you to test that theory." That was Wednesday afternoon in March. By Saturday morning, Richard's phone was buzzing so relentlessly that his wife thought there was a family emergency. In a way, there was. The company he'd built his executive reputation on was crumbling, and every vibration was another multi-million-dollar account asking the same question. Where did Nathan Harper go? Stories about corporate power, loyalty, and what happens when companies forget that relationships matter more than org charts. That's what this channel explores. Welcome to Corporate Vault, where we hold the real stories behind business headlines that never quite tell the whole truth. Building this channel is about creating a community of people who understand that business isn't just spreadsheets and strategy decks. It's human. Joining this journey toward the first 1,000 subscribers who get it would mean building something together, not for algorithms, but because these stories deserve an audience that understands their weight. I'm Nathan Harper. Before Richard Pembroke learned the difference between managing accounts and maintaining relationships, I was Senior Acquisitions Director at Whitmore Industries, a mid-sized logistics firm in Philadelphia. I started in the warehouse at 22, loading pallets in summer heat, learning every driver's name, understanding what made the night shift crews frustrated, and why our smallest clients often had the most valuable insights. Coming from a middle-class family in Wilmington, Delaware, my parents ran a small hardware store where every customer had a name, a story, and usually a problem we could help solve. My father used to say, "Business is just people who need things talking to people who have things. Forget that, and you're just moving boxes around." The story really begins 11 years before that resignation, when Whitmore was struggling to break into pharmaceutical distribution. I was barely a year into my account coordinator position when I suggested something radical. Instead of competing on price, compete on attention. They gave me 3 months with a mid-tier pharmaceutical company called Riverside Labs. Instead of standard corporate courtship and presentations about capacity, I spent 2 weeks just observing. I sat in their distribution meetings, watched their loading dock operations, talked to their warehouse managers about what kept them up at night. Turns out it wasn't delivery speed or cost, it was predictability. Their warehouse manager, Thomas Brightwell, told me during a coffee break, "I don't need miracles. I need to be able to tell my team when to show up and actually be right." I redesigned our entire routing protocol for Riverside around consistency, not speed. We built in buffers, created backup routes for common delay points, and implemented real-time notifications for any variance greater than 15 minutes. Within 6 months, Riverside Labs shifted 40% of their East Coast distribution to Whitmore. Thomas mentioned our approach to a colleague at Bergen Pharmaceutical Solutions, one of the top 15 pharmaceutical distributors in North America. Within 18 months, Whitmore had become their primary logistics partner for the entire Mid-Atlantic region. That Bergen contract was worth $18 million annually, and it established a pattern that would define my career. I didn't manage accounts. I built relationships by understanding that behind every corporation was a collection of human beings with specific frustrations, hopes, and professional reputations on the line. Richard Pembroke noticed. He promoted me to senior account manager and gave me free rein to pursue major acquisitions. "Do whatever you did with Bergen, but do it 12 more times." The next acquisition was Coastal Manufacturing Group. Their logistics were handled by 3 different companies, creating coordination nightmares. I spent a month mapping their entire supply chain and designed a unified system that solved the underlying coordination problem. The CEO, Elizabeth Thornton, stopped me on slide 3 of my presentation. "I've seen enough projections. Tell me what you know about our actual problems." I explained the 4-hour dead zone between their Tennessee facility and Delaware assembly plant, where 2 different logistics providers created a handoff problem neither would claim responsibility for. Elizabeth leaned back. "You've done more homework in a month than our current providers have done in 3 years. When can you start?" Coastal became a $24 million annual account. Elizabeth sat on the board of the Mid-Atlantic Manufacturing Alliance, and my approach became something she mentioned frequently. Over the next 5 years, 4 more major manufacturing accounts came to Whitmore specifically asking for me. By year 7, I'd brought in 9 major accounts, each worth between 12 and 30 million annually. Richard had become director of operations, and Whitmore had tripled in size, opening facilities in Baltimore, Richmond, and Newark. The dynamic between Richard and me had shifted. He still championed my work, but there was an edge now. During strategy sessions, he'd make comments like, "We've built great systems that anyone can execute," or "The real value is in our infrastructure, not individual relationships." I didn't argue. Richard was technically right that Whitmore's infrastructure was excellent, but arguing about credit seemed petty when everyone was prospering. The 10th acquisition was Nexus Logistics. They approached Whitmore about a partnership for overflow capacity. It was a relatively minor contract, maybe 4 million annually, but it introduced me to Nexus's founder, Graham Westbrook. "You ever think about going independent?" Graham asked me one morning over coffee. This was about 8 months before the resignation. "I have equity in Whitmore, and Richard's been good to me mostly," Graham smiled. "That mostly is doing heavy lifting." He wasn't wrong. By year 10, the edge in Richard's comments had become less subtle. During a quarterly review where I'd expanded the Bergen account by $12 million, Richard spent 15 minutes praising the team's efforts and Whitmore's systematic approach without once mentioning my name. When I pointed this out privately, Richard sighed. "We need to build a sustainable organization. That means not creating a cult of personality around individual employees. Clients need to see Whitmore as the solution, not Nathan Harper." The 11th major acquisition was Atlantic Shipping Consortium, a $42 million annual contract that required 8 months of negotiation. I'd worked with their chief supply chain officer, Robert Chen, for over a year, building trust through small pilot programs. When Atlantic signed, it was the largest single account in Whitmore's history. The board threw a celebration dinner. Richard gave a speech about institutional excellence. My name appeared once in a list of 7 people, sandwiched between the IT director and head of compliance. Robert Chen pulled me aside afterward. "That was awkward. Does Pembroke understand that I signed with Whitmore because of you specifically?" "He understands it differently. He sees it as validation of the company's systems." Robert frowned. "I've worked with dozens of logistics companies. They all have good systems. I work with people I trust. If you ever go somewhere else, call me." The 12th acquisition was supposed to be the crown jewel. Pinnacle Industries had annual logistics expenditure of $68 million, split among 4 major providers. The courtship took over a year. I leveraged every relationship I'd built. Elizabeth Thornton introduced me to Techforward's COO. Robert Chen provided a reference. Bergen's VP mentioned our work at an industry summit. I proposed a unified logistics management system that would integrate everything under Whitmore's coordination, creating a single point of accountability. The final presentation to Techforward's board was scheduled for a Thursday in January. The night before, Richard called me into his office. "I'm going to lead the presentation tomorrow. Richard, I've been the primary relationship for 14 months. They're expecting me. This is a $68 million decision. They need to see that Whitmore's executive leadership is directly invested." The presentation went well, mostly because Techforward's executives kept directing questions to me. But the optics were established. Richard was the strategic visionary, I was the capable implementer. Techforward signed in February. $68 million annually, with a 5-year commitment. It pushed Whitmore past the $250 million revenue threshold and attracted acquisition interest from 2 major national logistics corporations. The Business Journal article featured Richard prominently, discussing his strategic vision and relationship-based approach. My name appeared twice, both times as part of the Whitmore team. One acquiring corporation did thorough due diligence. After interviewing key clients, they requested a meeting with Richard. By Thursday, Richard called an emergency executive meeting. The assessment identified a structural risk. Several major clients expressed that their relationship with Whitmore is significantly dependent on specific personnel. Everyone knew he meant me. "We need to systematize these relationships, ensure they're institutional rather than personal. All major accounts will have rotating relationship managers and team-based client interaction protocols." Over the next 6 weeks, Richard implemented his new protocols. My major accounts were assigned relationship teams with rotating leadership. I was moved into a strategic advisory role that functionally removed me from direct client interaction. The clients noticed immediately. Bergen's VP called me directly. "Nathan, what's happening? I've got 3 different people from Whitmore calling me. None of them seem to know our history, and I'm being asked to fill out survey forms about needs we addressed 5 years ago." I explained the new team-based approach diplomatically. He was silent, then said, "I don't work with companies. I work with people who understand my problems. This feels like I'm back to being a number in someone's portfolio." Similar conversations happened with Coastal, Atlantic, and Tech Forward. I escalated the concerns to Richard. His response was curt. "Change management always faces resistance. They'll adapt." The breaking point came during a quarterly review with Tech Forward, 3 months into the new system. A capable but junior account manager named Kyle Stephenson led the meeting. I sat silently while Kyle walked through performance metrics. Tech Forward's COO, Patricia Drummond, listened politely for 20 minutes before interrupting. "These metrics are fine, but they don't address the coordination issue between the Texas and North Carolina facilities." Kyle looked confused. "I don't have any flagged issues from those regions in my briefing materials." Patricia's expression hardened. "Because I mentioned it to Nathan 3 weeks ago during a site visit. I assumed it was being addressed." I had indeed discussed it with Patricia and sent a detailed memo to operations. It had been routed through the new team-based system, assigned to a task force, and scheduled for evaluation in the next monthly planning cycle. "We're in the evaluation phase," Kyle said. "Should have recommendations by next month." Patricia stood up. "Next month, a timing issue I raised 3 weeks ago will have recommendations for evaluation. At our scale, that delay costs approximately $40,000 weekly." She looked at me. "Nathan, is this what working with Whitmore looks like now?" That evening, I pulled together actual numbers on what was happening with my 12 major accounts since the new system. Client satisfaction scores were down 18%. 3 accounts had reduced their contract scopes. 2 had filed formal service complaints. Meanwhile, Whitmore's internal metrics showed everything was fine. Response times were within targets, delivery accuracy was unchanged, cost efficiency had improved. Richard saw efficiency gains. Clients felt erosion of relationship quality. Both perspectives were factually accurate. I requested a meeting with Richard. His office was on the top floor now, physically separated from operations. "Richard, we need to discuss the major account situation. Client satisfaction is declining measurably." He glanced at my data, then pulled up his dashboard. "Internal metrics don't support that conclusion. We're hitting all contractual obligations." Contractual obligations aren't the same as relationship health. Patricia Drummond was visibly frustrated yesterday. Richard's expression took on patronizing patience. "Nathan, I understand these were your accounts, and there's emotional attachment. But what you're interpreting as declining satisfaction is actually the normalization of appropriate professional boundaries. Richard, these clients have specifically said." "I know what they've said. And it's exactly the problem. They've become too dependent on individual relationships instead of trusting institutional capabilities. We're correcting a structural weakness you inadvertently created." The implication hung in the air. I was the problem. Support the transition. Stop freelancing solutions when clients reach out directly. Route everything through proper team channels. Let the system work. Graham Westbrook from Nexus called me that weekend. "You sound exhausted." I gave him the abbreviated version. Graham listened, then said something that reframed everything. "Nathan, what would happen if you left? Some would stay because switching costs are high. Some would reduce engagement. A few would probably leave entirely." "Which few?" "Bergen, Coastal, probably Atlantic. Tech Forward would definitely restructure their contract." Graham was quiet. "So conservatively, Whitmore would lose 80–90 million in annual contracts?" "Possibly. But that assumes clients would follow me somewhere." "Is that presumptuous?" Graham asked. "Or just accurate pattern recognition based on relationships you've built over 12 years? The opportunity came from an unexpected direction. Nexus had been approached by pharmaceutical and manufacturing clients asking if Nexus could expand into their sectors. Graham had operational capacity and capital, but lacked established relationships. "I'm not poaching you," Graham said carefully. "But there's a spot here for your approach. Full partnership equity, complete autonomy over relationship strategy, and a company culture that believes people matter more than processes." I spent 2 weeks thinking about it. Not just strategically, but ethically. Would leaving and potentially bringing clients be betrayal? The decision crystallized when Richard unveiled plans to potentially sell Whitmore. The team-based relationship model has significantly reduced our key person risk. We're now an attractive acquisition target because we're not dependent on any individual talents. He said it like an achievement. All I heard was confirmation that my 12 years had been successfully made irrelevant. I drafted the resignation letter that evening. Simple, professional, expressing gratitude while noting a decision to pursue a different direction. Wednesday afternoon, I slid it across that mahogany table. His laugh wasn't cruel, just dismissive. Anyone can manage accounts, Nathan. You're not irreplaceable. I invite you to test that theory, I said and walked out. By Thursday morning, I'd signed partnership papers with Nexus. By Thursday afternoon, I started making calls, not sales pitches, just informational conversations. Wanted to let you know I've moved to Nexus Logistics. No pressure, but if you ever want to discuss how we might work together, I'm available. Bergen's VP was immediate. Send me Nexus's capabilities deck and standard contract terms. We've been looking to diversify anyway, and honestly, service quality at Whitmore has declined noticeably. Elizabeth Thornton from Coastal was equally direct. Nathan, I told you years ago that I work with you, not your company logo. What can Nexus handle? By Thursday evening, I had serious interest from 5 of the 12 major accounts. By Friday afternoon, that number was 7. Meanwhile, Richard's phone started buzzing. Friday morning, Patricia Drummond requested an urgent meeting to discuss strategic direction of the partnership. Then Bergen called. Then Atlantic. By Friday evening, Richard had left me 3 voicemails, progressing from confused to irritated to carefully controlled anger. The weekend was when things accelerated. Robert Chen from Atlantic called Saturday morning. Our contract with Whitmore has a 60-day termination clause for cause, and we can argue cause based on recent service declines. Can Nexus absorb our volume? I conferenced in Graham. We spent 2 hours on the call. By Saturday evening, Atlantic Shipping had formally notified Whitmore of contract termination and signed a letter of intent with Nexus. $42 million in annual revenue, gone in an afternoon. Sunday, Bergen Pharmaceutical followed. Their contract had a 90-day wind-down clause which they invoked, simultaneously signing with Nexus. $18 million annually, plus the expanded $12 million in cold storage. Coastal's contract was locked for 8 months, but Elizabeth was explicit. The day we can legally switch, we're switching. Consider this advance notice. By Monday morning, Richard was facing crisis. 2 massive accounts formally terminating, several others clearly preparing to leave. Richard showed up at Nexus's offices, demanding to see me. When Graham politely but firmly explained that wasn't happening without an appointment, Richard's composure cracked. He's stealing our clients. This is tortious interference. Graham remained calm. Mr. Pembroke, clients are making independent decisions based on their business needs. Nathan has not solicited anyone, simply made himself available. If Whitmore's service met their needs, they wouldn't be leaving. The legal threat was empty. Clients have freedom to choose vendors, and I'd never signed a non-compete. By Wednesday, 72 hours after that resignation letter, the full scope was clear. Atlantic and Bergen had formally switched. Coastal, Tech Forward, and 3 other major accounts had filed contractual notices of intent to terminate. 2 more were in active negotiations with Nexus. The total, 12 accounts representing $140 million in annual revenue, either already moved or in process of moving. Richard's phone buzzed constantly. Clients demanding explanations. Board members demanding damage control. The national corporations interested in acquiring Whitmore suddenly went quiet because the valuation had cratered. Whitmore's stock price dropped 38% in a week. Business publications that had praised Whitmore's growth now ran articles about massive client exodus and hidden risk of relationship-based business models. The irony was bitter. The headlines framed relationship dependence as the problem, when the actual problem was a leader who failed to understand relationships were the foundation. Graham and I worked 20-hour days for 2 weeks, managing transitions, ensuring every client experienced seamless service continuation. Bergen's first shipment under Nexus went out on Tuesday morning. Thomas Brightwell, the warehouse manager who'd given me my first break years ago, called when the shipment arrived exactly on schedule. Feels like old times, competent people who give a damn. Missed this? Nexus had effectively doubled its annual revenue in 2 weeks, going from $200 million to $340 million. But the real validation came from clients. Tech Forward's Patricia Drummond sent a handwritten note. Business is built on trust and competence. You delivered both for years, and Whitmore took it for granted. Their loss, quite literally. Richard made one final attempt at contact about a month later. He requested a meeting through formal channels. We met at a neutral location. Richard looked diminished, the executive confidence replaced with something defensive. I underestimated the situation. The board has asked me to explore whether there's any possibility of you returning, or at least helping transition the remaining accounts to minimize further losses. Richard, you laughed when I resigned. You said anyone could manage accounts. He looked uncomfortable. I was wrong, clearly. The question is whether we can find a path forward. There is a path forward. Whitmore can focus on the systematic, process-driven logistics model you believe in. Nexus will focus on relationship-based, customized solutions. The market has room for both. You know that's not sustainable for us. We built our growth on those major accounts. You built growth on relationships you then decided were unnecessary. This is the consequence of that decision. Richard's jaw tightened. So this is revenge? This is the market working exactly as it should, clients choosing providers based on value delivered. If Whitmore's systematized approach was genuinely superior, clients would have stayed. They didn't. That's not revenge. That's feedback. Whitmore Industries survived, but fundamentally changed. They scaled back operations, closed facilities, and refocused on smaller accounts where systematic efficiency mattered more than deep relationships. Richard remained as director of operations, though the board explored replacing him. The national corporations walked away entirely. One executive, speaking off the record, said, "The episode revealed that Whitmore's value was concentrated in assets that could walk out the door. That's not a company you acquire, it's a risk you avoid." For Nexus, the growth was transformative. Graham's operational excellence combined with my relationship approach created exactly what we'd believed was possible. A company where systems enabled relationships rather than replacing them. We hired carefully, looking for people who understood that logistics wasn't just moving things efficiently, but understanding why those things mattered. Within 18 months, Nexus had expanded into 3 new sectors. Annual revenue crossed $500 million. About 2 years after the resignation, I ran into Richard at an industry conference. During the break, he approached, seeming genuinely interested in talking. Company's stable. We found our level, not what it was, but sustainable. That's good to hear. I've thought a lot about what happened. I still think I was right about the risk of personality-dependent business models. But I was wrong about how to address it. You can't systematize relationships. You can only build teams capable of creating them. It was the most self-aware thing I'd ever heard Richard say. Would have been useful to learn it less expensively, he said with a rueful half-smile. We talked for a few more minutes, surprisingly free of tension. Enough time had passed that lingering resentment seemed pointless. Richard had learned an expensive lesson. I'd built something better. The clients had ended up with service that met their needs. Thomas Brightwell from Bergen found me in the lobby. He was considering retirement after 33 years. You remember when you first showed up at Bergen, barely 30 years old, asking to shadow our operations for 2 weeks. Most vendors wanted to pitch us. You wanted to understand us. That's when I knew you were different. That approach changed my career, Thomas continued. Because you fixed a real problem we had, other people started asking my opinion about logistics partners. I became a subject matter expert because someone actually cared what I thought. Thank you for that. Sometimes the impact of work isn't measured in revenue or contracts. Sometimes it's measured in moments like that. Nexus continued growing. We created training programs focused on client understanding, not just service efficiency. New hires spent their first month doing rotations through client facilities when possible. Account managers had explicit permission to break standard protocols if client needs required it. Graham and I formalized something that had been implicit. The company would never be sold to an acquirer who didn't share the foundational philosophy. We built that into the corporate structure. We're probably leaving money on the table, Graham acknowledged. We're selecting for investors who value what we value. That's not leaving money on the table. That's making sure money doesn't end up driving decisions that undermine why we built this. Today, Nexus Logistics employs over 800 people across 12 facilities in 6 states. Annual revenue exceeds $1.2 billion. Graham and I have stepped back from daily operations, focusing more on strategic direction while an exceptional leadership team handles execution. Several original clients from the Whitmore days are still with us. Bergen Pharmaceutical, Coastal Manufacturing, Atlantic Shipping, all still working with Nexus 15 years after making that switch. Whitmore Industries still exists, though it was eventually acquired by a regional competitor. Richard Pembroke retired several years ago. I heard he occasionally teaches a business ethics seminar, using the Whitmore situation as a case study. There's something admirable about that. The speaking, writing, and consulting work continues. Industry conferences want perspectives on relationship-based business development, on managing the tension between personal connection and institutional sustainability. The first speaking engagement was terrifying. A logistics industry summit, 300 people, 40 minutes to convey insights that felt too nuanced for standard presentations. I abandoned the slides halfway through and just told the story. The response was overwhelming, not because the story was dramatic, but because it resonated with so many people's experiences. Account managers who felt undervalued, executives struggling with how to scale personal service, clients frustrated by vendors who treated them like numbers. During Q&A, a young account manager asked, "How do you know when relationship focus crosses into unhealthy personality dependence?" Healthy relationships are based on competence and understanding, not personal charisma. If clients work with you because you understand their needs better than alternatives, that's valuable and transferable. If they work with you because you're charming, that's personality dependence. The test. Could you teach someone else to serve that client effectively? If yes, it's healthy. If no, it's risky. What happened at Whitmore wasn't about Richard being a villain or me being a hero. It was about a common organizational pathology, mistaking the mechanism for the foundation. Richard saw systems and processes as the foundation, with relationships being a mechanism that needed to be systematized away. The reality was inverse. Relationships were the foundation, and systems should have been mechanisms that enabled those relationships to scale. That distinction matters across industries. The most successful companies understand that behind every transaction is a human being whose experience matters. Systems should make positive experiences consistent, not make human beings irrelevant. For anyone building something, whether a company, a career, or just trying to do good work in complicated environments, the lesson isn't about dramatic resignations or massive account transfers. It's about knowing what foundation your value rests on, defending that foundation even when it's inconvenient, and building systems that strengthen rather than replace what matters most. Richard learned that lesson expensively. I learned it by being forced to test whether my philosophy could survive outside an established company. The answer was yes, but only because the philosophy was sound, not because I was irreplaceable. The real validation came years later, watching others develop similar capabilities, seeing Nexus thrive as new leaders emerged, and knowing that what was built could outlast any individual. That's sustainable value. Not immunity to change, but resilience rooted in shared principles that can be taught, learned, and perpetuated. Corporate Vault exists because these stories matter beyond the individuals who lived them. Business journalism covers the dramatic successes and failures, but misses the underlying human dynamics that actually drive most business outcomes. If this resonated, if the dynamics feel familiar from your own experiences, joining this community as it grows toward that first 1,000 subscribers would mean building something together. Not just an audience, but a group of people who recognize that business is fundamentally human and that understanding changes everything. The vault is open, and there are many more stories worth telling.